The sky over Europe was already crowded with death. It was the winter of 1944. High above the frozen fields and shattered cities of the continent, thousands of American aircraft clawed their way through flak-filled airspace. Engines roared. Propellers screamed. The air trembled with the violence of industrial war. And somewhere in that sky, an American fighter pilot pressed the trigger. The gun spat fire. Metal tore through aluminum skin. An aircraft shuddered, broke apart, and fell, burning, toward the earth. But this was no enemy plane. It carried American markings. American crewmen. American lives. And when the smoke cleared, when the wreckage struck the ground, and when the reports reached command, the pilot responsible was not court-martialed. He was decorated. Awarded for heroism. For valor. For doing the unthinkable. This is not a story of betrayal. It is not a tale of recklessness or madness. It is a story born of impossible choices, made in seconds at 20,000 feet, in the deadliest air war the world had ever known. To understand how a U.S. pilot could destroy an American plane and be honored for it, we must return to a time when the skies themselves were battlefields, and survival demanded decisions that still echo through history. Europe, 1944. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a terrifying intensity. Every day, formations of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, lifted off from bases in England and Italy. Their targets were deep inside Nazi-controlled territory, oil refineries, aircraft factories, rail yards, and cities vital to Germany's ability to wage war. The mission was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Fly straight. Fly together. Drop the bombs. Get home. But German air defenses had turned the skies into a killing zone. Anti-aircraft guns, flak, lined the approaches to every major target. Fighters of the Luftwaffe waited above and below bomber streams, diving through formations in head-on attacks that shattered noses, cockpits, and crews. For the men inside the bombers, survival depended on formation discipline and mutual firepower. A single bomber carried up to 10 crewmen and bristled with machine guns, but alone it was vulnerable. A damaged bomber falling out of formation was often a death sentence. And it was here, in this narrow space between duty and despair, that our story begins. The bomber that could not keep up. Somewhere over occupied Europe, an American bomber formation was in trouble. Flak had already torn through the sky, exploding in black clouds that rocked aircraft violently. One bomber, its designation, serial number, and crew still unspoken, had taken a catastrophic hit. An engine was gone. Control surfaces were damaged. Fuel lines leaked vapor into the freezing air. Inside the aircraft, chaos reigned. The pilot fought the controls. The co-pilot shouted readings from failing instruments. Gunners reported jammed weapons, wounded crewmen, and smoke creeping through the fuselage. The aircraft could no longer maintain formation speed or altitude. And that meant only one thing. The bomber was now a target. Short sentence for impact. Alone. Damage. Marked for destruction. German fighters knew exactly what to look for. A straggler was an invitation. Luftwaffe pilots, many of them veterans hardened by years of combat, circled damaged bombers like predators. They waited for the moment when escort fighters were distracted, low on fuel, or forced to turn back. Once isolated, a bomber could be dismantled in minutes. But this time something different happened. Because nearby, weaving through the cold air, was an American fighter pilot who saw what was unfolding, and understood what was about to come. The fighter escort. The escort fighters of 1944 were not the short-range interceptors of earlier years. By this stage of the war, American fighters like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Fast, heavily armed, and flown by increasingly experienced pilots, they were the bomber's lifeline. Their mission was clear. Protect the formation. Engage the enemy. Do not abandon the bombers. But escort pilots also lived by another unspoken rule. Do not interfere unless necessary. What this pilot saw, however, was not a situation covered neatly by regulations. The bomber was barely flying. Its altitude was bleeding away. German fighters were forming up in the distance. And the crew inside had a terrible decision of their own to make. Stay aboard and fight gravity and fire. Or abandon the aircraft and hope to survive captivity, or worse. The escort pilot radioed the bomber. Static crackled across the channel. What followed would define both men's lives forever. The impossible request. The conversation between the fighter pilot and the bomber crew would later be described in official reports with cold, restrained language. But in reality, it was anything but calm. Voices strained with urgency. Words collided with fear. Seconds felt like hours. The bomber's pilot knew the truth. The aircraft would not make it back to friendly territory. It could not outrun German fighters. And if it crash-landed intact, sensitive equipment, and possibly crew, could fall into enemy hands. There was one option left. An option so extreme that it would challenge every instinct of loyalty and brotherhood in the air. The bomber crew asked for the unthinkable. Short sentence. They asked to be destroyed. Not with them inside, but after they bailed out. They asked an American fighter pilot to destroy their own aircraft. To deny it to the enemy. To spare it from being paraded as propaganda. To prevent wounded men from burning alive inside its shattered fuselage. The fighter pilot hesitated. No training manual prepared him for this moment. No regulation explained how to weigh lives against machines, duty against morality. If he fired, he would be shooting an American plane. If he refused, German fighters would finish the job, with far worse consequences. And the sky was closing in. A decision made at altitude. At 20,000 feet, there is no room for prolonged debate. Fuel gauges tick downward. Enemy aircraft close distance. Gravity waits patiently. The bomber crew began to jump. Parachutes blossomed open in the thin air, white silk against a gray sky. One by one, American airmen drifted downward toward an uncertain fate on the ground. The fighter pilot watched every canopy deploy. He counted them. He waited. And then, alone in the cockpit of his fighter, he made his decision. Short sentences for impact. No witnesses. No applause. Only responsibility. He lined up behind the crippled bomber. American insignia filled his gun sight. For a moment the aircraft seemed almost peaceful, coasting, empty, still flying on borrowed momentum. Then he squeezed the trigger. Fire in the sky. The fighter's guns erupted. Tracers streaked forward, tearing into wings, fuselage, engines. Metal fragments spun away into the slipstream. Smoke poured from ruptured fuel tanks. The bomber began to fall. It rolled, nose dipping, then plunged toward the earth in a spiraling descent. The escort pilot stayed with it until the end. Until the aircraft struck the ground and vanished in a column of fire and debris. Only then did he turn away. The radio was silent. Aftermath. Back at base there were questions. There are always questions when an American aircraft is lost. Operations officers reviewed mission logs. Intelligence officers debriefed returning crews. Fighter pilots filed reports accounting for ammunition expended, enemy engagements, and aircraft destroyed. One report stood out. An American pilot had claimed the destruction of a U.S. bomber. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant immediate investigation, possibly severe punishment. But these were not normal circumstances. Witness statements corroborated the story. Surviving crewmen confirmed the request. Commanders understood the tactical necessity. What the pilot had done was not an act of aggression. It was an act of mercy. And an act of war. Why this story matters. In the vast history of World War II, filled with epic battles and famous names, stories like this often fade into obscurity. They do not fit neatly into narratives of victory or defeat. They resist easy moral judgment. They force us to confront the human cost of industrial warfare. This was not a story of triumph over the enemy. It was a story of choosing the least terrible option in a sky full of terrible choices. And it raises questions that still matter today. What is heroism when all outcomes are tragic? Who decides where duty ends and humanity begins? And how should history remember those who carry such burdens? The pilot would not speak publicly about the incident for years. The medal would be awarded quietly. The citation carefully worded. The details left vague. But the truth survived, in mission reports, in crew testimonies, and in the memories of those who understood what it meant to make that choice. Transition tease. In the minutes ahead we will return to that mission. We will meet the men inside the bomber. We will trace the career of the fighter pilot who pulled the trigger. And we will examine the technical, tactical, and moral forces that led to one of the most extraordinary, and least understood, acts of aerial warfare in World War II. Because sometimes the bravest act is not defeating the enemy, but carrying the weight of a decision no one should ever have to make. The mission had begun long before the sun rose over England. On that morning in early 1944, cold mist clung to the runways of the American airfields scattered across East Anglia. Nissen huts glowed faintly with electric light as air crews stirred from uneasy sleep. Ground crews moved silently among rows of bombers, their breath visible in the freezing air as they fueled aircraft, loaded ammunition, and armed bomb bays with tons of high explosives. Inside one briefing room, a red string stretched across a massive wall map of Europe. Its destination lay deep inside enemy territory. A collective murmur spread through the room as crews studied the route. The longer the line, the greater the danger. Fighters could escort only so far. Flak would thicken as the formation approached its target. Losses were expected. They always were. The bomber crew. The bomber at the center of this story was a B-17 Flying Fortress, one of the most iconic aircraft of the Second World War. For engines, a wingspan of over 100 feet, a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, 4 gunners. Each man had a station. Each role was essential. And each carried the knowledge that survival depended not only on skill, but on luck. As the bomber lumbered down the runway and lifted into the gray morning sky, its engines vibrating through the airframe, none of the men aboard could know how the mission would end. They climbed steadily, joining dozens, then hundreds of other bombers assembling into tight formations over the English countryside. From above, the sky seemed filled with metal, silver aircraft reflecting pale sunlight as they formed massive combat boxes. It was a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Into enemy airspace, crossing the English Channel was always a moment of silence. Below, the gray water stretched endlessly. Ahead, the coast of occupied Europe loomed beneath cloud cover. Radios crackled with clipped voices as formations adjusted altitude and spacing. Then the first flak bursts appeared. Black puffs erupted in the sky, hanging for a split second before dissolving into smoke. Each explosion sent jagged fragments outward at lethal speed. A direct hit could tear an aircraft apart. Near misses could shred control cables, puncture fuel tanks, or wound crewmen. The bombardment intensified as the formation pressed inland. Inside the bomber, the noise was overwhelming. Engines roared. Flak hammered the fuselage. Intercoms crackled with shouted reports. And then it happened. The hit. A violent explosion rocked the bomber's left side. The aircraft lurched, throwing crewmen against their harnesses. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. One engine sputtered, coughed, and then burst into flames. The engineer called out damage reports as quickly as he could. Oil pressure, gone. Fuel line ruptured. Fire, spreading. The pilot fought the controls, struggling to keep the bomber level as the dead engine dragged against the airframe. Fire suppression systems were activated, but the flames refused to die. The bomber began to fall behind the formation. Every second the distance grew. They were becoming a straggler. The formation could not slow down. Bombers flew at fixed speeds and altitudes for mutual protection. To linger was to invite disaster for everyone. The order was unspoken but understood. Stay in formation, or face the enemy alone. As the gap widened, German fighters appeared. The enemy closes in. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 streaked through the sky, their silhouettes unmistakable against the clouds. They had been waiting for this moment. The damaged bomber was isolated. The gunners opened fire, their machine guns chattering as tracers streaked toward the approaching fighters. But with one engine gone and systems failing, the aircraft's defensive coordination faltered. Another burst of flak tore through the bomber's tail section. The intercom erupted with shouted warnings. Control cables damaged. Tail gunner wounded. Smoke in the fuselage. The pilot knew the truth. They would not make it home. The escort pilot. Above and behind the bomber, weaving through the chaos, flew an American fighter. He was part of the escort, a pilot trained not only in aerial combat but in discipline and restraint. His aircraft, fast and powerful, carried enough firepower to tear apart enemy fighters in seconds. He saw the bomber fall out of formation. He saw the flames licking from its engine nacelle. And he saw German fighters beginning to position themselves for the kill. The escort pilot broke formation. It was a calculated risk. Every mile he flew away from the main bomber stream increased his own vulnerability. But escort doctrine allowed initiative, and this situation demanded it. He moved closer, flying parallel to the wounded bomber, scanning the sky for attackers. A failing aircraft. Inside the bomber, conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Smoke filled the fuselage despite oxygen masks and ventilation. Electrical systems flickered. The aircraft shuddered violently with each adjustment of the controls. The navigator confirmed what the pilot already suspected. They were deep inside enemy territory. There was no chance of reaching neutral ground. The co-pilot looked at the pilot and no words were needed. They had reached the moment every bomber crew dreaded. The decision to abandon ship. Stay and burn. Jump and hope. The pilot ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. Parachutes were clipped on with shaking hands. Wounded men were helped toward the bomb bay doors. The radio operator sent a final transmission, reporting their position and condition before silence swallowed the signal. But one problem remained: the aircraft itself. If it crashed intact, or was captured after a forced landing, it could provide the enemy with valuable intelligence. New equipment, bombing mechanisms, radios, even operational tactics. And there was another danger. German fighters were still circling. If they attacked while men were bailing out, parachutes would offer no protection. The bomber's pilot looked to the escort fighter flying nearby, and made the call that would change everything. The request. The radio transmission was brief, urgent, unprecedented. The bomber pilot explained the situation. The aircraft was lost. The crew was abandoning it. Enemy fighters were closing in. Then came the request. After the crew bailed out, the fighter pilot was asked to destroy the bomber. Not out of spite, not out of panic, but out of necessity. To deny the enemy. The escort pilot heard the words and felt their weight immediately. He understood what was being asked. To fire on an American aircraft. To intentionally destroy it. To accept responsibility for the outcome. No training exercise had ever prepared him for this moment. But there was no time for prolonged reflection. German fighters were drawing nearer. The bailout. One by one, the bomber's crew began to jump. The fighter pilot circled, watching closely. He counted parachutes. 1, 2, 3. Each white canopy blossomed open, drifting downward toward fields and forests far below. He stayed alert, scanning for enemy aircraft that might attempt to strafe the descending airmen. More parachutes appeared. 4, 5, 6. The bomber was emptying. Smoke poured from the fuselage. The aircraft flew on, unmanned, slowly descending in a wide arc. Finally, the last parachute deployed. The fighter pilot waited. He counted again. All crew accounted for. The choice. The moment had arrived. The fighter pilot throttled forward, closing the distance to the abandoned bomber. His gun sight settled on the familiar shape, wings, tail, fuselage, marked with the same insignia he wore on his own aircraft. He hesitated. In that instant he was not thinking of medals or regulations. He was thinking of the men drifting below. He was thinking of the enemy closing in. He was thinking of responsibility. Then he pressed the trigger. Destruction. The fighter's machine guns roared. Tracers ripped into the bomber's wings and engines. Metal tore away in fragments. Fuel ignited in a sudden burst of flame. The bomber rolled, nose dropping sharply. Fire consumed the fuselage as it spiraled downward, breaking apart under the stress of gravity and damage. The fighter pilot stayed with it until the impact. A distant explosion marked the end. Only smoke remained. Return and reckoning. The escort pilot rejoined friendly aircraft and eventually returned to base. On the ground, mechanics swarmed over his fighter. Intelligence officers approached quietly. He was escorted to debriefing. There, in a small room filled with cigarette smoke and paperwork, he told the story. Every detail. The damage to the bomber. The bailout. The request. The destruction. The room was silent when he finished. This was not a routine debrief. Command decision. Over the following days, reports were compiled. Surviving bomber crewmen, now prisoners of war, would later confirm the account through Red Cross channels. Other pilots corroborated seeing parachutes and the final destruction. Commanders reviewed the situation carefully. Technically, an American aircraft had been destroyed by friendly fire. But the circumstances were extraordinary. The destruction had prevented enemy capture of sensitive equipment. It had reduced the risk to parachuting airmen. It had been carried out only after confirmation that the crew had escaped. The action was deemed necessary. And courageous. Recognition. The decision was made quietly. The escort pilot would not be punished. He would be recognized. A medal citation was drafted, its language careful, precise, restrained. It spoke of extraordinary judgment under fire and decisive action in the face of enemy threat. It did not dwell on the target, only on the outcome. As the war raged on, the incident faded from headlines, overshadowed by larger battles and greater losses. But for those involved, it remained unforgettable. A moment when war demanded not just bravery, but moral resolve. In the next section we will follow the aftermath. The fate of the bomber crew on the ground. The pilot's career after the incident. And how this single act came to be understood, not as a tragedy but as a grim necessity of total war. Because the story did not end when the bomber struck the earth. In many ways, it was only beginning. The war did not pause to reflect on what had happened in the sky that day. It never did. Aircraft continued to rise from English airfields before dawn. Bombers still droned eastward in endless streams. Fighters still climbed to meet them, engines straining, pilots scanning the horizon for movement. Yet for the men touched by that single decision, the destruction of an American aircraft by an American pilot, the war had changed forever. Because once a line like that is crossed, there is no returning to innocence. The fate of the bomber crew. The bomber crew descended slowly beneath their parachutes, scattered by wind and chance across enemy-controlled land. They landed not as conquerors but as survivors. Some were injured on impact. Others were helped from their harnesses by startled civilians or armed soldiers. Within hours, German forces had rounded them up. Weapons were taken. Flight jackets stripped away. Identity tags examined. They were prisoners of war. For the crew, captivity meant uncertainty, but also life. They would endure interrogation, hunger, cold, and long months behind barbed wire. Some would be moved between camps as the war progressed. Others would survive air raids from the ground, watching Allied bombers pass overhead, knowing they once flew among them. Years later, after liberation, those men would speak of that day not with bitterness, but with understanding. They knew what had been done. They knew why. And they knew that the fighter pilot's decision had spared them something worse. The pilot and the medal. The escort pilot returned to duty. There was no ceremony at the time. No public announcement. No dramatic presentation beneath fluttering flags. The medal came quietly. A citation placed in his file. A ribbon added to his uniform. A brief acknowledgement from commanding officers who understood the complexity of what he had done. The language of the award was deliberate. It spoke of exceptional judgment under combat conditions. Of decisive action in the face of imminent enemy exploitation. Of courage not defined by aggression, but by responsibility. It did not say he had destroyed an American plane. History rarely states uncomfortable truths plainly. But the truth endured. The pilot himself rarely spoke of the incident. Among fellow airmen, the story circulated in hushed tones, respected but not celebrated. There was no bravado attached to it. No tales retold in mess halls for laughter or praise. It was understood as something different. Something heavier. To judge such an act outside its time is to misunderstand the nature of the air war. World War II aerial combat was not a series of isolated duels between individuals. It was a vast, interconnected system of machines, logistics, intelligence, and human endurance. Aircraft were not merely vehicles. They were repositories of secrets. Bombing mechanisms revealed targeting methods. Radio equipment exposed frequencies and codes. Navigation tools disclosed routes and procedures. Allowing a crippled bomber to fall intact into enemy hands was not just a loss of metal, it was a breach of security that could cost lives on future missions. And beyond strategy lay humanity. A damaged aircraft circling under enemy fighters was a death trap for parachuting crewmen. Strafing of helpless airmen, while officially condemned, was not unknown. The escort pilot's decision reduced that risk. In doing so, he accepted responsibility for an act that few could bear. The moral weight of war. War compresses time. Decisions that would take months of debate in peacetime are reduced to seconds in combat. There is no perfect choice, only less disastrous ones. The destruction of the bomber was not an act of violence against comrades. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The aircraft was already lost. The crew had already escaped. The enemy was already closing in. What remained was a choice about control. Who would decide the aircraft's fate? The enemy, or its own side? Control matters. Agency matters. Responsibility matters. The escort pilot chose to act. And history quietly agreed. A broader legacy. Incidents like this were rare but not unique. Throughout the war, commanders occasionally ordered the destruction of friendly equipment to prevent capture. Bridges were blown with Allied troops still retreating. Ships were scuttled by their own crews. Aircraft were burned on runways during withdrawals. These acts were never celebrated. They were endured. What made this incident stand apart was its intimacy. One pilot. One aircraft. One decision. At altitude. Under fire. With no committee, no orders, no second chances. After the war. When the war ended, medals were tucked away in drawers. Flight jackets were replaced with civilian coats. Pilots returned to ordinary lives carrying extraordinary memories. The escort pilot lived with his decision long after the engine stopped roaring. He had saved lives. He had destroyed a symbol of American air power. He had done both at once. In later years, as historians pieced together the air war with greater clarity, incidents like his gained renewed attention, not as curiosities, but as windows into the psychological burden borne by those who fought. They remind us that heroism is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is deeply uncomfortable. Measuring the impact. Statistics can never fully capture such moments, but they offer perspective. During World War II, the U.S. Army Air Forces lost over 18,000 aircraft and more than 26,000 airmen killed in combat operations. Thousands more became prisoners of war. Every decision that preserved even a handful of lives mattered. In this case, an entire bomber crew survived. The incident-sensitive equipment was denied to the enemy. Escort doctrine proved flexible under extreme conditions. One action rippled outward, subtly but meaningfully, through the machinery of war. What this story teaches us. This story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is difficult. It resists simple labels of right and wrong. It challenges romantic notions of combat heroism. It forces us to consider leadership at its most personal level. The pilot did not act out of hatred. He acted out of duty, to his fellow airmen, to the mission, and to a future he could not see. In doing so, he embodied a truth often overlooked. That courage is not always about advancing. Sometimes, it is about ending something so others may live. When we think of medals, we imagine triumph. But some medals are not awarded for victory over the enemy. They are awarded for carrying the unbearable weight of choice. High above a shattered continent, in a sky filled with smoke and fear, an American pilot made such a choice. And history quietly recorded it, not as a mistake, but as an act of honor. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you reflect on the true cost of war, consider supporting this channel. Like the video, subscribe for more deeply researched historical documentaries, and share your thoughts below, because history lives not only in archives, but in the conversations we continue today.